Welcome to State of Tech, Synechron's innovation podcast. Synechron is a leading global digital transformation consulting firm focused on financial services and big technology organizations. Our State of Tech podcast hosts subject matter experts and business leaders as they explore emerging technologies, industry insights, innovation trends, and more. Let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome to today's episode of DORA in Action. I'm your host, Jitske de Bruijne, and today we're diving again into the Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA, which aims to enhance the digital resilience of the financial sector. After our last podcast about DORA and third-party risk management today, we will focus on preparing for compliance. Joining me today are two esteemed guests, Frank Ooms, lead expert in outsourcing at Lanschot Kempen, and Derk van den Heuvel, Associate Director of Technology at Synechron, who is actively working on DORA implementations at a Dutch bank. So we have a lot to discuss today, especially with the compliance deadline set for January 17, 2025. Let's explore the challenges financial institutions face and how they can prepare for compliance. Can you tell us a bit more about where we stand?
Yeah, I think to start off, to put this a little bit into context, DORA is asking banks to take a risk-based approach with regards to DORA that is proportional in approach that takes into account their size, their overall risk profile, and the nature and scale, complexity of their operations. I think the other point is also that DORA is asking banks to identify and to map their ICT services that support critical or important functions. From my experience, what I can see is it has taken organizations some time to define this approach and also to complete this mapping. One of the other elements of DORA is that it is asking banks to take another critical look at their current ICT risk management framework and to see what measures need to be put in place to strengthen this framework. And in my view, there's two elements to this. There's looking at what is required from a DORA perspective, but also how requirements are embedded in the current way of working within the IT organization. In my view, it is this last part where I can see most of the efforts currently taking place.
If you look at third-party risk, I think there are a few challenging elements. For instance, some of the regulations are still not final. For instance, the RTS on subcontracting. And only recently, the ITS on the Register of Information was published. But the most challenging part is the dependency we have on the willingness of third parties to cooperate. We are obliged to comply with the DORA, but they don't. So we're totally dependent on their cooperation. And that's challenging.
So if you look at what needs to be done to get compliant or at least moving to compliance somewhere next year?
On the IT risk management side, I think where organizations have been focusing is first to understand what needs to be put in place. And in my experience, this is taking a look at the requirements within DORA, understanding those, and then seeing how these requirements have been included in current policies and the standards that apply within the bank. So this is again the watch that I was alluding to earlier. So this obviously has taken some time to get right. As part of that, banks have most likely made a gap assessment, and these gaps have most likely been addressed. And the second element to this is what actually has been included in standards and policies, and then taking a look at, okay, what is practically happening and the how to fulfill what's outlined in policies and standards. And again, this is taking a look at what do we have currently in place and what changes do we need to make to strengthen our current IT risk management framework. And in the end, to be more operationally resilient from an IT perspective. So this is where most of the efforts are taking place at this point in time.
The challenging part, as I already mentioned, is the cooperation with the third parties. Changing contracts to make them DORA compliant, collecting data for the Register of Information. That's a challenge. But if you look in the broader perspective concerning third-party risk, we were already EBA compliant, but the scope of DORA has forced us to reassess our current outsourcing management framework and restructure it as an ICT third-party risk management framework. This means a total overhaul of our current way of working, which we have taken a risk-based approach. Derk already addressed it, a risk-based approach. And you can imagine the risk involved in licensed software that we run on-prem are far more limited than those involved in a SaaS solution. And I think in general, the business change involved is the most challenging part. Drafting policies, standards, and procedures is not that complicated. It is the change in the way people actually work that is the most challenging. And that is something that will take us far beyond the deadline of January 17th.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was alluding to earlier. Embedding what DORA is asking for in your organization. For instance, also taking a look at incident reporting. It is taking a look at what the requirements are, some specific factors in the way that incidents need to be classified in order to understand whether these need to be reported. But again, it's also asking organizations to do this based on their current size and complexity. So it is really this practical way of looking at things where I can see a lot of discussion taking place.
Focusing on that incident management process or the incident reporting process, I think that's a typical example of the impact of DORA. We've decided not to change our current incident management process. We're satisfied with the way we're currently working. So, for instance, the qualification of incidents, we use a priority 1 to 4 classification. We haven't changed that based on the criteria DORA provides for reporting incidents. We have established a separate reporting process in which we assess the incidents based on the DORA criteria and see whether they should be reported or not. But we haven't changed the actual incident management process because we were satisfied with that process and its effectiveness. And the DORA requirements for reporting weren't helping us with that incident management process. That's why we chose to implement a separate incident reporting process.
Okay, and DORA leaves also space to do that your own way and to make your own decisions.
I had a discussion yesterday with a colleague of mine that heard that DORA would be principle-based. If you look, for instance, at the incident reporting or the register of information, that's not principle-based, that's rule-based. But looking at the way you set up your processes to do the reporting, that's not defined. So there we think we have the ability or the possibility to design our own process, and that's what we have done.
Are you speaking to other parties, like other banks or asset managers, to hear how they looking at DORA and how far they are or what they're doing?
Yes, in recent weeks, we've regularly contacted colleagues, but also some branch organizations and discussed the implication of DORA. And luckily, we're all in the same boat and experience the same issues. And that gives me the confidence that what we're doing is okay. And there are parties that are integrating the reporting process in their incident management process, but there are other parties that have chosen the same path as we did. So you see that in the actual implementation, everybody chooses the way it fits them the best.
Yeah, and I think that's what I hear from colleagues that are working on DORA assignments as well. I think by and large, the approach is similar. Obviously, there's different context, there's different size of organizations, there's different complexity. I think this is also why this proportionality principle has been put in place. But I think from what I'm hearing, a lot of organizations are taking a very diligent approach to this. Again, making the translation between what is required within DORA and how do we embed this in our organization.
It makes sense. And luckily, everybody's speaking to each other and is in the same boat, as you both said. So how important is the 17th Jan deadline?
Yeah, I think from my point of view that the 17th of January deadline gives focus. This date has been put in place to make sure that there's a date and time that helps banks to focus on what needs to be put in place. So in my view, the significance of the date is really to put focus in place and to make sure that we are working towards a date. In my experience, from what I can see, most organizations won't necessarily be finished by the 17th of January. From my point of view, what is most important is that you can outline the approach that you've taken on the road to become DORA compliant, and that you can showcase that there is a plan in place for you to address the actions that you've defined in order to become compliant. On the other side, I don't think you will necessarily be finished with this roadmap because I think DORA is another step on a roadmap to build out the operational resilience. DORA builds on previous regulations, such as, for instance, the ABA regulations on third-party management. but also other frameworks such as GDPR. I think in essence, DORA is another step towards building the maturity of IT organizations within banks.
I totally agree, Derk. For us, it's also a focus point, but we won't be finished at the 17th. Just to be clear, I already mentioned the dependency on third parties. I don't think that every contract will be DORA compliant at the 17th of January. But on the other hand, if you look at some of the elements of DORA, and an important part when looking at ICT third-party service providers is monitoring of those parties. But if you look at the elements within DORA concerning monitoring, that's not very specific. The reference is made to audit rights. There's a reference made to assurance. So, for instance, ISO certificates or ISA declarations. But do those instruments provide us with enough information to say, okay, we're digitally resilient? That's something we still have to establish in the upcoming years. Because from my perspective, looking at those instruments, they don't give you an actual and a clear picture of what an ICT third-party service provider really has implemented to ensure information security. For instance, about passwords, you can find an ISO certificate that a password has been implemented. The ISA probably says that the password policy has been implemented and there has been control and whether there are controls concerning password implementation. But what the actual characteristics are of a password, so whether the company has implemented a password length of 5 characters or 20, that's not defined. And actually in those details, define the actual level of information security. And that's something we don't know. So that's something we have to continue working on because we already had the same issues or challenges under the ABA guidelines on outsourcing. But that's something we're already thinking about. What are the next steps to get a better grip on ICT third-party service providers? That's the real challenge in my view.
I think a bit on putting things just down on paper, that's not enough. It's also really about how are you going to use it? What is the challenge in getting from paper to the real action, like the change in mindset and maybe even culture to realize what's being aimed for with DORA?
Yeah, I think from my side, there's a couple of challenges. I think first off, proportionality. So how do you make sure that you define a proportionate response that can be delivered in time, taking into account the 17th of January deadline, but also complies with the sentiment of the regulation? I think I can see that as a key challenge. I think the second one is around resources. Obviously, there's a need for skilled resources. An example of that would be external legal counsel, but also if an organization wouldn't have the necessary resources to help with implementing the requirements. But I think the greatest value here is to be made by people who have experience with connecting theory with practice. On the one side, you can see certain technical standards that are very specific, but it's also taking the practical approach to see, okay, this is what we've put on paper, but is this actually something that has value for us to implement within our IT organization? And the challenge there is also to make sure that this effort doesn't balloon into something that becomes unworkable. So I can see that as being a challenge. And finally, from a practical angle, we should also bear in mind that some organizations will come on top of efforts to run the bank work and comes on top of an already backed change portfolio. Specifically now in this last period of the year with change freezes, there are some key challenges in there.
Looking at the scope of DORA, it's a wide array of regulations. It covers the totality of the organization because risk management is not only part of the work of a DevOps team or an IT security department. Our commercial staff has to be risk focused. To be honest, most people in their daily work don't think about risk. They think about servicing their clients or getting the application in order. That's the biggest challenge, I think. And I'd like to react to what Derk just said concerning the linkage between theory and practice. And that's the biggest challenge because you could look at those regulations and say, okay, it says this and this, and we'll be implementing it. It's about aligning the rules and regulations with the specifics of your own organization and the challenges of your own organization. And the proportionality principle helps, but it's not very specific in its definition. So what we try to do is look at the focus or the objective of the DORA, looking at our situation, the way we are organized, how we deal with information security challenges, looking at the objective of DORA, what's the best way to go forward. And to do that, you do need people that have an overview both on the regulations, but also on the actual situation at the company. It's about pragmatism. What's the way to go forward? And you should have people on board that can look at the rules and say, okay, this is the way we, within our context, are going to apply it. And I think that in the future, the role of an information risk management department will be more focused on this kind of elements instead of implementing a certain risk management framework or whatsoever. And that's what we are currently looking at. And what's the role of our information risk management team within the context of DORA?
I've heard a lot of challenges, a lot of work is being done already. Can you just, for closing it off, give your view in 1-2 sentences on it, 17 Jan? How will your company move on?
The champagne bottles will be opened on the 18th of January, I assume. But as we already mentioned a few times, this is a business change project. Risk management and digital operational resilience should be in the veins of our organization. We still have some steps to take, and that won't be finished by the 17th of January. So it will only be a brief moment of rest and looking back on all the efforts we have taken, but work won't stop.
As I alluded to earlier, many organizations will have defined a number of actions that they will need to take. That work won't necessarily all be finished by the 17th of January, the first quarter, second quarter of the next year, and maybe even beyond that, there is work to do to address the requirements within DORA. But as we mentioned before, I think this is another step on a larger road towards making sure that the IT organizations within banks are in the end more resilient.
It's good work what we're doing together, right?
Definitely. I think there are a number of elements in DORA that ask some very good questions of IT organizations in financial institutions. And I understand it obviously is a lot of work. It is really a significant effort to understand the regulation and to make sure that you understand what you need to do and how you need to do. But in the end, this will improve the resilience of IT organizations within banks.
I totally agree, because at first I said, oh my God, what's this?
Yeah.
But if you start implementing it, you notice that there are a lot of the elements are coherent, and some of that coherence wasn't present in our current setup. So from that perspective, I do think that it's a trigger for further improvement, and I see it as something very positive. That doesn't mean that everything we have to do in the context of DORA is pleasing and creating a lot of fun. But in the end, I think the experience will be positive.
Speaking about key challenges, can you briefly explain the challenge of creating a register of information?
If you look at for Lanschot, we have a large number of ICT third-party service providers. Looking at the amount of data we have to collect, we've estimated that we have about 20,000 data points to fill in. And that's already, from a number perspective, a big challenge. But a lot of those data have to be provided by the third party. For instance, a lie code or a European unique identifier. Not every company has a lie code. We've estimated that approximately 40% of our ICT third-party service providers have a lie code, but 60% don't. And that means that we have to request them to provide such a lie code. They have to require such a code, they have to pay for it. And that's not something they gain any profit from other than pleasing our request. And another challenge we have, the alternative is the European unique identifier. And one of our ICT third-party providers contacted the Chamber of Commerce where identifiers should be registered, and they didn't know anything about the European unique identifier. And that's quite challenging, taking a lot of resources. Luckily enough, we have a contract management application that has the provider has implemented DORA functionality, so can register the data in the tool and it will provide us the information for the report. But it's a lot of work, and it's work that doesn't provide us any additional value, because we already have insights in our contract. We already have insight in our total risk exposure on third parties. So it's something we predominantly do for the supervisory authorities. And we'd rather have spent all that capacity on improving our ICT or digital operational resilience. But that's a personal opinion.
I think not only the effort will be on the first implementation, but I think the other effort is also on maintaining that information and making sure that it stays relevant and accurate. I think that will also take a significant amount of work. And again, an embedding in your current operational way of working. So I think that's also part of the effort that is not to be underestimated.
Luckily, as I already mentioned, our service provider for the contract management application has implemented that functionality. So every change in contract and every change in a service provider will be automatically registered in that tool. I think by doing that, it helps us a lot in maintaining the accuracy of that register. But if you don't have that, then it's challenging, because what are you going to do? Are you going to register every change in an Excel file, or what are you going to do? So that's also, from an operational side, one of the biggest challenges within the DORA regulation.
Can you explain a bit more about the expectations for ICT service provider contracts? So what should be in there? How does that work?
Yeah, we already addressed the register of information, but the ICT third-party service contracts are a similar challenge. On the positive side, DORA specifically defines what should be in the contracts, but defining that doesn't mean that an ICT third-party service provider will say, okay, that's your requirement, we'll implement it in our contracts. So the parties will discuss the added value for them for those changes. They sometimes just simply refuse to implement those elements. Some parties say, okay, we're willing to change the contracts, but then we charge you an additional yearly fee for changing that contract. I discussed this challenge with a representative of the EIOPA a few months ago. I asked him, if a party doesn't want to comply with those requirements, what should we do? He suggested that we should terminate the contract and look for another party. I said, that can't be true, because that would mean that a party that's totally digitally operational resilient, but doesn't want to change the contract in line with the DORA, that we should terminate that contract and switch over to a party that is less digital resilient, but is willing to change the contract. That can't be the consequence of DORA. In those cases, we also take a risk-based approach. If a company doesn't want to comply with certain elements within the requirements of DORA, if they don't comply, what's the impact of that? Does that create a risk or not? Are we still able to monitor that party or not? So that's also there. We look on a case-by-case basis what to do. But that also takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And that's one of the elements I'm certain of that won't be finished by the 17th of January. And what you also see is that parties wait to provide their amendments to current contracts in view of the fact that the RTS on subcontracting is not finalized yet. Some say we're not going to discuss any changes to current contracts if not all the regulations are final. So that means that there's a lot of work in December, at the end of the year, just because everybody's waiting for clarification.
To expand on that, thing that I'm seeing is basically on the back end of the contract changes. Obviously, there also needs to be a mechanism for then monitoring what you've agreed in those contracts. Again, within the IT organization, there will need to be an effort for certain parts of the IT organization to then be in constant discussion with the service providers to make sure that what has been agreed in the contract is being monitored, but also to see if there's any gaps in there that there then are actions defined and implemented to make sure that those gaps are addressed. So baking DORA into the service contracts is one step. The other step is to actually make sure that in the daily way of working, then checking those requirements and making sure that they are fulfilled is being done.
Thank you both very much for your insights. Looking forward to everything that DORA and its implementation will bring.
Thanks for listening to the Synechron State of Tech podcast. Don't forget to like and share this episode and subscribe to stay up to date on all of the latest and innovative technologies savvy businesses need to know about. To learn more about Synechron, head to our website at www.synechron.com. Stay tuned.